Thresholds are used to create a record of notable events occurring within your network. When a defined threshold is breached, an event record is created, and you can report on those event records and configure alerts to trigger in response to those records. StatSeeker allows you to configure thresholds against every metric, raw and calculated values like averages, standard deviations, 95th percentiles, that sort of thing. And you can also threshold against interpreted values such as anomaly strength or even predicted values using trend lines or forecast data. Now, the scope mentioned there covers a fair bit of ground, but you may have noticed an omission, and that's state changes such as device up-down events, interface opera status changes, that sort of thing. State changes automatically create event records for reporting and alerting purposes. You don't need to configure anything there. StatSeeker thresholds will look after everything else. That's all of your time series data. I'm not going to go into the alerting side of things here. In this video, I'm just going to focus on threshold creation and reporting on the thresholds that you've got running. So let's jump straight in. To configure thresholds, we head to the admin tool, alerting and event management, threshold config. Add a new threshold, and I'll start by giving it a name. I'm going to set a threshold for outbound traffic utilizing more than 90% of the link for the last 10 minutes. Attribute is the entity type and metric that I want to threshold against, and we can see that the entity list contains all of the entity types that this particular server is configured to monitor. The content of your list may well be different depending on what version of StatSeek you have or what CDT packages you've got installed. I'm going to use interface txutil. For format, I want the average outbound utilization over the 10 minutes, and I'll get back to interval in just a moment. Let's move on to the conditions that will trigger a breach. Condition is above and the value is 90. Interface utilization is measured in percent, so this value is 90%. If we were looking at traffic speeds, they might be measured in bits per second, and looking at traffic counts, it'd be in bytes or packets, depending on the metric. Generally, it's in the name. If you aren't sure about the format used to specify the value, create a simple custom report and have a quick look at the raw values. Let me show you. Reports, edit, new report, the name is interface units, tabular report on interfaces. Now, a field that comes to mind is an attribute that we might not really threshold against, but we may want to filter a threshold by, and that is interface speed. So field is speed, and I'll just copy that field and change the configuration to instead show the raw value. And before I run, rather than asking the server to return speed values for every interface on my network, let's quickly drop in a filter and return data for just a single interface. Here's the speed that we would typically see in a report or in a dashboard, something like that. But here, where we specify the raw value, we see that when StatSeeker asks an interface for its speed, it is returned in bits per second, and this raw value is what we need to specify in the threshold configuration. So if you're not sure on the format to use, or if your threshold isn't triggering in a way that you expect it to, confirm that you're specifying the raw values. So back to our threshold. Average outbound utilization above 90%. Now, interval. The interval is how often a threshold is assessed, and an interval without an accompanying time filter acts as both the interval and the time filter. We have an interval of a minute, so every minute we will check the last minute's worth of data and see if the average utilization is over 90. But I'm looking for sustained bursts of outbound traffic. I want a 10-minute average over 90%, so interval is 10 minutes. So now, every 10 minutes, we check the average outbound utilization for the previous 10 minutes. But in this instance, if we've got a burst starting halfway through one interval and ending halfway through the next, we're going to miss it. So a rolling average. I need both the interval, check the threshold every minute, and a time filter. Data range is the last 10 minutes. Every minute, check the average outbound utilization for the previous 10 minutes, and if it's above 90%, record an event. This is the one I'm after. The trigger option here lets me manage how events are recorded in response to threshold breaches. The only on transmission option records an event when the threshold is breached, and then another when it leaves that breach state. The option while in breach will record a new event and potentially trigger a new alert every time the threshold is assessed and found to be in a breach state. For our example, where we're assessing the threshold every minute, if an interface is found to be in breach of the threshold, we record an event. A minute later, the threshold is assessed again. If the threshold is still in a breach state, we're recording a new event. and again a minute later, and if there was an alert hanging off this threshold, we would be getting a new alert sent every minute that the interface remained in breach of the threshold, so assign the while in breach setting wisely. I'll come back to device aggregation in an example shortly. For the time filter, well, we just saw how you can specify the range of data to use to calculate the metric assessed by the threshold. The last 10 minutes. We've also got options for hours, days and months. And we've got options for day, week and month so far, as well as the option to utilize the advanced time filter editor to customize a time filter as needed. Onto the attribute filters. These use configuration data to filter the targets of the threshold. We're looking at interface data, so we can set a filter against any interface configuration value. And because an interface resides on a device, we also have access to device configuration fields. So device location is London, and it's a regex, so I'm going to use London or Paris. So now we're only looking at interfaces on devices in either of these locations. And I can add additional filters. Let's go with an interface attribute. We'll use speed, and we know from the test report that we ran earlier that speed is specified in bits per second. So if I want to restrict the threshold to just the gigabit interfaces in these locations, I'll just drop in the value. And the other option here is employing entity filters. And again, I can use the interface to select specific interfaces or specific devices, or I can use my groups such as routers or WAN links, whatever's going to be useful. When you're happy with your threshold configuration, save it. Let's have a look at another example. New threshold, let's say we've got some metered connections and I want an alert when one of these connections has used a terabyte of data. So interface, total bytes, and the format is total. I'm going to check it twice a day, and I'm going to alert on transition and specify my threshold value in bytes. And I'm limiting this alert to the interfaces in my metered links group. Let's say meter connections get data caps renewed on the 25th of the month. So the time filter is range equals ***25, midnight to now. If you aren't sure on your time filter, you can use the test facility in the advanced time filter editor. Here I can test it and see in the result that I've got from the previous instance of the 25th of the month to now everything is looking good. The one setting that we've skipped past has been device aggregation. With our current example, we're looking at traffic across individual interfaces. By removing the interface filter and setting device aggregation to total, we're now thresholding against total traffic across any device rather than a specific interface on a device. Another use case for this might be with CPU load. You're interested when a device is under load, not when a single CPU on a device is under load. New threshold, server CPU at 95%. For attribute, the entity type is CPU and the attribute is load. An interval of 2 minutes, a value of 95, and my group filter to my servers group. So as it is now, if any CPU on a server tops 95% average load across 2 minutes, I'll be recording an event. But if we set device aggregation format to average, we now need the average load across all CPUs on the device to be greater than 95% before the event gets recorded. By default, when creating a new threshold, the configuration is automatically enabled, and you can disable a threshold configuration from within that configuration or from the threshold list. The disabled thresholds are grayed out in the list, and you can filter the list to display threshold configurations based on this state. Typically, you'll be creating thresholds in order to trigger alerts, and as we saw, you can apply filters to your threshold configurations to target groups, specific devices, or specific entities. This temperature sensor or that file system, you can get as granular as you like with your threshold configuration. But you can also leave your thresholds totally open, network-wide, and instead hang any number of targeted alerts off a single threshold. The outbound utilization threshold that we have here, I can configure an alert that only triggers when an interface in a remote office breaches that threshold, and the alert is sent to an engineer that's responsible for that office, and then create a separate alert hanging off the same threshold for another office where the alert message will be sent to a different engineer. You can filter at the threshold or the alert level or both, whatever's going to work for you. Now, the last thing I want to cover is reporting on your thresholds. We always suggest that you baseline your network with regard to thresholds, and once you're confident that your threshold levels are where you want them, Then begin anchoring your alerts, and that way you won't get alert floods. To do that, you can configure your thresholds and let them run for a while, and run reports against them to see instances of threshold breaches. Are my thresholds too low or too high to capture the behaviour that I want to be alerted to? Let's have a look at my threshold reports here. In the console, down in thresholds here, we have our 3 linked reports. Now these are stock reports available on every StatSeeker server, but you can always create your own custom reports and anything, including event records, in the reporting section. There's a lot of documentation and a number of videos. You can check it all out if you're new to customizing reports. The first report, the threshold summary, details the currently configured thresholds. What's it called? What am I thresholding against? And is it currently enabled? Drilling down from the threshold name, I'll be opening the second report, the threshold report, but filtering it to that selected threshold. We can see the devices that the threshold applies to and the number of breaches for that device. Drilling down from a breach count, we'll open the third report, the threshold event report, again filtering to what we've just clicked on, and that will present to me all of the records associated with that threshold on that device in that reporting period. And we can see the records of the interface transitioning across this threshold, and we can filter these to just highlight the breach events, and if we want to, we can drop in a note against the record. Configure your thresholds and monitor them through the reports, and then adjust as needed. If you do amend a threshold configuration, the event record history for the old configuration will be deleted. So that way you're not seeing any records against the new configuration that applied to the old values. If you want to keep the history, disable the old configuration, duplicate it, make your changes in the new version and save that one. And that's a quick overview of threshold configuration and monitoring.